27. If she slipped a blade out of her wrist sheath, she could reach up and sever his Achilles tendon. Both of them if she was quick. Throw a handful of sand in his eyes as she jumped to her feet, and run. Anahita's instincts urged her to do just that, but she knew she could not. Not yet. For if half the marketplace gossip about this man was true, she could not risk leaving him alive. Running could wait until after the deed was done. Until then, cold calculation would occupy her mind, as it always did. Haidar and Asad had taught her well. In the meantime, she allowed herself the small fantasy of choking him with the very shoe he'd balanced on the back of her neck. Watching his face grow red, then purple, then blue as he gasped for air that would never again reach his lungs. Take her to the women's tent, where they can prepare her for our wedding. If she pleases me tonight, you can carry word back to your master on the morrow. If she does not. The foot pressed against her neck, making it hard to breathe. Perhaps I will make her head my gift to the Sultan, and the next gift the Sultan sends will be more acceptable. The sheikh did not know how wrong he was, but Anahita had no desire to enlighten him just yet. His time would come and she would enjoy it. For now she forced her face to appear blank as Haidar and Asad took her arms and hauled her to her feet. She itched to brush the dust off her embroidered gown, but that too could wait. Some servant could deal with the damage when she returned home. She would not wear this again if she could help it. She would have enough to do, finding another way to break Philemon's curse. Once this current task was complete. First, she had to grind Basset's face in the dirt. Asad thrust her through the flap of the largest tent in the camp, from blazing light into darkness. It took her a moment for her eyes to adjust, which was time enough for Haidar to drop a bag of her things at her feet, and inform the women of their sheikh's orders for her. Then the tent flap closed entirely, leaving her alone with what looked like 100 women, curious about the newest of their number. Anahita relaxed. She knew her place in a harem, even this one. She allowed the women to lift her dusty robe off, and pretended not to notice their exclamations at the quality of the work, or the quantity of dust on it. She's so small. He'll break her on her first time. She looks terrified. Such a pretty tunic. Are the jewels real? Anahita let their words wash over her, not uttering a word except to nod occasionally if someone asked her a question. A new bride in a new home was supposed to be nervous. Never mind that she outranked all of them. Once she married their sheikh, her place would be his to dictate. So she surrendered to them for now. Should we tell her? Warn her maybe. Can't risk it. She should save herself if she can. What if she suffers the same fate as Inbal? Inbal, a girl who could not have been older than 10, Anahita discovered, had had her tongue cut out for saying something that displeased the sheikh. Anahita resolved to avenge the girl. Make her so beautiful he cannot resist. Oh, isn't the silk lovely? So fine you can see quite through it. That will not last the night. Women washed her with cool water, then applied perfumed oils to her skin before helping her into her wedding clothes, the contents of the bags Haidar had brought. Sheer silk so thin that in the right light you could see through it, but only her husband would see that, in the privacy of his tent tonight. She fastened the bells onto her bracelets herself, while 2 small girls did the same with her anklets. A thin chain of bells clipped to her belt, and her dance clothes were complete. Do you think they will succeed? They must. This cannot go on. Don't forget to oil her hair. You know how grabby his hands can be. At least give her a chance. They combed, curled and oiled her hair, a luxury Anahita had not allowed herself while they traveled. Hair oil seemed to pick up every speck of dust in the desert, but tonight its glossy sheen would catch the light once she took her veil off. She knew she was too plain to attract him with her beauty, even Philemon had said so. Wish we dared poison the wedding feast. He and his favorites alone will eat it, this poor mite won't eat a bite. Better that way. What would he do to her if she vomited her food at his feet? Don't even think it. Whoever does the deed will have my thanks. And mine. Who is it, do you know? One of the men. They all want the honor of delivering the final blow. Of course they do. They know what it means. Over the gossamer silk, they placed another heavily embroidered robe, the blood-red color of her marriage bed. Jewels had been sewn into this one, dark rubies that glittered in the light, drawing attention to the curve of her breasts beneath it. When will it happen? After the feast, when he takes her to his bed. Actually Shush, she looks scared enough. Don't frighten her further. It must be tonight. The matching jeweled veil completed her bridal clothes, covering Anahita's hair and all but her eyes. Doesn't she look a vision? He will not be able to resist. Good. A gentle hand landed on Anahita's shoulder, and she met the pitying eyes of an older woman. It's all right to be afraid, chick. All brides fear their wedding night. Just stay silent, lie back, and submit to whatever he wishes. It will be over quickly. Anahita's heart sank as the woman didn't say the final line of bridal advice she'd heard so many times in her father's harem: you might even enjoy it. No one here enjoyed Sheikh Bassett's attentions. No wonder they were plotting a coup tonight. A coup that could not succeed if the sheikh was already dead at her hands. Did she have the right to take vengeance away from these women? Stolen from their fathers, husbands, families to serve his pleasure? But none of the women would deliver the blow. And she had her answer. She didn't need a man to save her. Anahita would save herself. And all of them. The moment that asshole put his foot on her neck, he'd sealed his fate. 28. Philemon sat, forgotten with the camels and other animals. Would this be his fate forever? Even the passionate kiss of the princess he loved had not been able to break the curse. If Anahita couldn't do it, then could anyone? Or would he be alone forever? The sounds of feasting and merriment came from a well-lit tent near the middle of the encampment, beside the women's tent where they'd taken Anahita. Women walked between the two, carrying platters of food or what remained of it, after the men had devoured everything. He hadn't heard a single female voice since he arrived, he realized. No laughter, no chatter, none of the normal sounds he'd expect from normal women. They might be more outspoken in Tasnim than other places, but nowhere had he ever met women who were forced into silence. It was against their very natures. There was something very wrong in this camp, and he wished he were far from it. But he could not leave Anahita here among the worst of it. With that sheikh who didn't deserve to kiss the ground she walked upon. Whose wedding feast they were no doubt celebrating now. A feast to give the bridegroom stamina, for the true test of a wedding was whether he could keep the bride in his tent until morning, when the wedding breakfast they shared concluded the marriage ceremony. Yesterday he would have bet money on Anahita not staying until morning, but after what he'd seen today. Had her men drugged her? Given her something that would make her more docile? Or cast some spell on her that had the same effect? Was that why he'd been kept away from her, and made to ride with Haidar? He prayed they had not, but he could not be certain. Even if he was, what could he do? He was a frog. Are we still doing it tonight? An unfamiliar voice whispered. Of course. Every day under his rule is an abomination to the honor of all good men, a second voice hissed back. And their wives, the first one muttered. Why didn't someone just poison his food? Didn't you see the boys he has lined up at his feet? Their mothers cook the meals and must feed each dish to their own sons before he tastes a single bite. That's how he foiled the first poisoning attempt. The women do not dare any more. It must be us, and we cannot fail. When? There was so much arguing, I couldn't stay to find out what they decided. An ambush after the feast, when he is too drunk on wine to see it? Of course not. He'll be expecting that. Besides, did you see him drink more than a cup of wine at the feast? No, he has all his wits about him now, and he will expect an attack as he walks back to his tent with his princess. She's barely more than a child, my wife said. Would you willingly give your daughter to that monster? I'd sooner kill my daughter than give her to him. It is fortunate I don't have one. Not yet. If you get your wife back on the morrow, I'll wager you'll be busy planting one in her belly before sundown. If she still lives. She hasn't left the women's tent in weeks. She's the only healer left. They're probably keeping her busy, healing the girls the morning after he's had them. If he'd killed someone, we'd know about it, for who'd he send to bury her, him? Maybe. So when will we finally be rid of him again? We wait until he's distracted, deflowering his child bride, and then we strike. What about the girl? If she gets in the way, kill her too. No one here will mourn her. Philemon opened his mouth to shout that he would, but he knew it was no use. They wouldn't hear him. Only Anahita would understand him. Someone needed to warn her. He'll probably crush her the first time he tries to mount her. They say that's what happened to Ahmed's daughter. He broke her hip bones with his weight, and she wouldn't stop screaming, so he killed her. If she's screaming, he won't hear us until it's too late. Cheers and catcalls rose from the feasting tent. Look out. He's heading to bed. The plotting men disappeared into the shadows as a couple appeared on the track that ran between the tents. He held a torch aloft in one hand as his other arm encircled the waist of a girl dressed head to toe in blood red. Anahita. It had to be. She walked willingly, he noted. The sheikh did not need to drag her. She should be trying to tear loose from his grasp, to run away. Philemon shouted a warning at the top of his lungs, but she didn't seem to hear, for she kept going. To her death, he was sure of it. Cursing his already cursed body, Philemon leaped down from the camel's back and headed after them. He had to warn her about the monstrous sheikh and his imminent death. A warning just for her ears, for the sheikh would not understand him. He hopped faster. He had to save her. 29. It took every drop of Anahita's self-control not to sink a blade into Barset's arm as he marched her away from the feasting tent. Not that she'd wanted to stay, but his meaty fingers biting into her arm would leave bruises. Her stomach protested that she hadn't eaten, but Anahita ignored it. No one had offered her food or wine at the feast, even her previous husbands had made an effort to feed her. Then again, with Barset's greedy eyes on her, she hadn't felt like eating. While he stuffed himself and his men drank countless toasts to his health and virility and other such manly virtues, she'd watched the crowd. Several men had slipped out, unseen by anyone but her, and she'd witnessed whispered conversations between the serving women and some of the men seated at the lower tables. The bloated bastard beside her was blissfully unaware of the coup his own people had planned, while she saw signs of it all around her, spreading like a sickness. Eyes watched from the darkness between the tents as they passed, but none came close enough to kill the man. No, they wanted her to distract him. And she would, but not in the way they had planned. For she was not a pawn in anyone's game. Not her father's, not Barset's, and definitely not the strange one played by his people. Barset shoved her through a tent flap, shouting for some guards to take their position at the entrance. Haidar and Assad, she hoped, as they'd planned. Gaily colored silk cushions lay in piles everywhere, not unlike Maram's bedchamber if she'd tripled the number of cushions and not cared about the colors. Or the cleanliness of them, Anahita realized, noting the stains on several of them. A patch of dried blood here, something white encrusted across two of them, something yellow that had turned part of an azure blue cushion murky green. She shuddered. Get your clothes off. Now, Bassett growled, shoving her toward the dirty cushions. Anahita ducked her head to hide the fury in her eyes. In the Sultan's harem, it is traditional for a new bride to perform an intimate dance for her husband as she removes her wedding clothes. I am told it is necessary to increase a husband's pleasure. Actually, Maram had told her it gave her a way to take off her own clothes without her husband noticing how many knives she carried, but Anahita wasn't going to tell him that. Bassett threw himself on the cushions and folded his arms across his chest. I will be the judge of that. Show me. Anahita took a deep breath, then began to mark the beat with her feet, stamping on the ground until she had the rhythm in her head. Then she began to move, unfastening the heavy red gown slowly as she moved her hips to swirl the skirt. Bassett grunted. She released the last fastener and let the gown's own weight carry it to the floor, revealing the thin silk tunic she wore underneath. A twirl unfurled the skirt fully, showing off everything before the folds settled again, giving only a tantalizing glimpse as she moved. The heavy red veil was next. She turned her back as she tore the garment from her head, shaking it out so that it flew like a banner behind her as she danced. She turned to face him, revealing her face to him for the first time, and held her breath. Plain she might be, but the women here had done their best to paint her eyes to make them look bigger, and redden her lips too. The obvious approval in his expression made her breathe out a sigh of relief. She danced faster, her every movement sending the bells on her belt jingling. Enough dancing. Take the rest off, Bassett ordered. Anahita pretended not to hear, planting her hands on her hips as she moved them again, more slow and sensuous this time. I said now. He grabbed her arm and dragged Anahita around to face him, tearing her sleeve. Another gossamer silk tunic, ruined. What was wrong with men? Anahita met his eyes. And I say no. 30. The track between the tents seemed to stretch forever. Philemon would never get there in time to warn her. Not before that misbegotten camel herder got his hands on her, and what if he hurt her? Philemon sucked in a breath and hopped faster. Of course the sheikh's tent was at the far end of the camp, where no one could hear the screams of his women as he tortured them, most likely. Barbarian. 4 guards stood at the entrance. 2 tribesmen, Haidar and Assad. Philemon cursed. He couldn't go in without her men spotting him. He hopped around the back of the tent, looking for another way in. Maybe if he squeezed under the tent wall here, digging under it a little, he might manage. A woman's scream sliced through the night. Then another. From inside the tent. Anahita. He squeezed through the gap, not caring what happened to him, and caught sight of Anahita struggling with the sheikh. He had to stop him. Couldn't let him hurt her. But what could a frog do? He eyed the sea of cushions between him and the woman he loved. Her marriage bed. He'd make Bassett rue even looking at Anahita. Philemon leaped. 31. Anahita started to scream, startling Bassett into releasing her. She didn't hesitate, thrusting her knife up to pierce his throat. Once, twice, then a third time. Bassett jerked his head up, ripping the blade from her hand, before she could deliver a final blow. Gasping for air, he could no longer breathe. Bassett fell heavily against her, nearly knocking her over. Anahita fought to stay on her feet, then to push him off her. He weighed so much, but she gave an almighty heave and she was free. He tumbled back onto his soiled cushions. Beside a naked man. Philemon? She opened his mouth to ask how, or perhaps why. The guards chose that moment to charge into the tent. Anahita thought fast. He killed him. He killed him, she screamed, pointing at Philemon as she backed into a corner of the tent and curled up into what she hoped looked like a hysterical wife pushed past what her mind could handle without going mad. Haidar and Assad would seize him, he'd turn back into a frog, and chaos would ensue. She could retrieve her knife and slip off into the darkness. Though if she had time, she'd still like to cut out his tongue. "You killed the sheikh?" one of Barsat's men asked shakily. Philemon drew himself up to his full height. "I did. Honor demanded it." Anahita suppressed a snort. There was nothing honorable about Barsat's death. She'd made certain of that. In the silence that followed, she risked another look. Barsat's men had dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the floor. Assad and Haidar slowly followed their example. "Honored Sheikh, what are your orders?" one man asked. Philemon's mouth opened but no words came out. Anahita wasn't as familiar with desert politics as Maram, but she vaguely remembered something about tribes where leadership was won by being the strongest fighter, and the succession was not by birth, but by force of arms. Kill the leader and you inherited his position. Was it like that here? Assad seemed to think so. "Most honored Sheikh, would you like us to bring you a better wife to warm your bed? One who is not so hysterical?" He nodded in Anahita's direction. She buried her head in her hands again and whimpered a little. Her throat was already sore from screaming. She didn't want to do it any more tonight, if she didn't have to. "This one will suit me fine. I'm sure she will calm as soon as you remove the corpse from her chamber," Philemon said. "And bring us fresh bedding." "As you command, most honored Sheikh," they chorused. Anahita's hands clenched into fists. When she got Philemon alone, she would throttle him for this. This wasn't her plan at all. 32. The guards took an eternity to carry all the cushions out of the tent, or so it seemed, before they set up a bedroll big enough for a bridal couple. 2 men rolled the former sheikh in the blood-soaked carpet beneath him, then lifted the grisly bundle between them. "Wait!" A 3rd man made them set their burden down and open it. "By all that was holy, why?" Philemon wanted to scream. The 3rd man pulled the knife from the sheikh's breast, wiped the bloodied blade on his own robes, then held it out to Philemon. "Your blade, honored sheikh." It was a pledge of fealty, however informal, and Philemon had accepted enough in his time as Prince of Tasnim to know not to refuse. Gingerly, he took the knife and nodded. It was a small blade to have taken the life of such a large man. Small and delicately curved, yet the blade was wickedly sharp. The hilt was worn from use, any sharp edges softened by the grip of how many hands? A dagger passed down through generations of desert people, until being buried in the guts of some insignificant sheikh. A dagger whose owner would surely return for such a valuable weapon. Philemon looked up. The men were gone, leaving him alone with Anahita. He dropped the dagger where the bloodied carpet had once lay. It sliced into the sand and stood, hilt deep, as though it would murder the whole desert next. Philemon shivered. He had to do something before the dagger's owner returned and tried to use it on Anahita too. "You're a fool, Philemon the frog," Anahita said, rising to her feet. "You should have stayed out of this." Philemon seized her shoulders. "How could I? The whole camp could talk of nothing but how they would kill you and your husband on your wedding night. He could have killed you. And he'll be back once he realizes he left his knife behind. What in heaven's name made you blame his death on me? The real killer is out there, and it's only a matter of time before he claims leadership over this squalid camp for killing the last leader. What do you think he'll do to me for trying to claim his kill? Or you?" Anahita tossed her head and met his eyes. "What else was I to do? They should have taken you into custody, and the moment you left this excuse for a boudoir," she kicked one of the cushions that the men had missed, "the moment you left, you turned back into a frog and escape. In the chaos that ensued, my men and I would be able to escape unseen. By the time they remembered us, we would be well on our way. Her eyes narrowed. Now take your hands off me, or I will turn you into a eunuch like Haidar and Assad. The shiver of steel touched his groin. Do your bits grow back when you turn back into a frog? She asked. Philemon released her, stumbling back. His eyes went to the knife, but it had vanished from the sand, as if it had never been. She twisted the silky belt slung across her hips and sheathed the knife. Another twist and the belt was back in place, an innocuous-seeming string of bells that hid a deadly secret. You killed him, Philemon whispered, not wanting to believe it. What did he ever do to you? Anahita shrugged, a smile twisting her lips. Nothing. I saw to that. That disgusting old man will never steal another woman from her husband again, or attack my father's people. On the morrow or the next day, my men will find an excuse to slip away with me, and we will return home. I am a woman of my word, you may come home with us. But no one can ever know what I did here tonight. Or I will use one of my blades on you. Philemon choked. One of your blades? You have more? He stared at her. She wore little more than the belt, and smaller versions of it at her wrists and ankles. Why, she was practically naked. Philemon averted his eyes. How many more? He asked, trying not to think of her smooth, curved flesh. 7, she said. 7 more. He stared at her in horror. Her face, not the rest of her. 7. His mouth was suddenly dry. For all he'd traveled with her, he barely knew this barbarian princess. He should have listened to her. Should have stayed in the waterskin, just like she'd said. Then he wouldn't know any of this, and he'd be blissfully ignorant that the woman he'd fallen in love with was some sort of demon. Of course. Forgive me for worrying about your safety. You can take care of yourself, I see now. He turned on his heel and headed for the exit. Please don't go. His foot hovered above the sand that should be saturated with her bridegroom's blood, but Philemon hesitated to put it down on what was, to him, another man's grave. A man he had wished gone only hours before. I'm only doing what you asked me to. Returning to where I belong, to wait until we leave. Wait until morning. Please? It's my wedding night. I should not be alone. There was an edge of desperation in her voice, or did he imagine it? Then perhaps you should not have killed your husband. He could have warmed your bed. I cannot. Because heaven help him, he wanted her. Never mind the knives or that she'd killed a man or pinned the crime on him. If he shared her bed tonight, he wouldn't be able to keep his hands off her. She lifted her chin. I had no choice. Do you think I like killing? My first husband deserved his fate a dozen times over, but I had no grudge against this one until today. But I swore an oath, and my father heard me do it. So he sends me to be his assassin, in the name of peace. He keeps his hands clean, yet mine are awash in blood. As always, on my wedding night. Such is my fate. It is not the fate you deserve. If you were my bride, your wedding night would be glorious, as it should be. I swear it. She stared at him. It was her turn to be shocked. Philemon wished he hadn't said it. To admit his weakness in front of her, why, she could stab him in the heart without needing any of her 7 blades. Normally my men would take me away, the hysterical bride, to calm me down, and when the nightmares invade my sleep, we are too far from the camp for anyone to hear my screams. But tonight you were here, and you made me stay. Why are you here, Philemon? She hadn't called him a frog. He took it as encouragement, however tiny it might be. Because I couldn't let them kill you with him. Even let you witness what they intended to do to him. You deserve better. A wedding night to remember, for the right reasons, not the wrong ones. She laughed softly. I remember all my wedding nights, especially the first. I've survived 5 husbands and 5 wedding nights I would give anything to forget. Let me make it up to you. Tonight. The moment the words left his lips, he regretted them. And yet, now they were out, he had nothing left to lose. Give me one night, I beg you. From now until dawn. I will finish what we started last night with that exquisite kiss. If I cannot deliver what I promise, a wedding night like you deserve, filled with the pleasure such a lovely princess deserves, then do what you will with me. Carve me up and feed me to your falcon. He spread his arms wide and closed his eyes. 33. Faced with Philemon in all his naked glory, completely at her mercy, for the first time Anahita felt shy. She unfastened the cuffs at her wrists, letting them tinkle to the floor, followed by her belt, and finally the ankle cuffs. Naked and unarmed, her breathing short and ragged, she crossed the cushions until she stood before him. Anahita took a deep breath, then took his face in her hands. She stretched up even as he yielded to her, and their lips met. Even before her lips parted, he stole her breath, so tender was his kiss. She could kiss him all night. And yet, her heels dropped to the floor, so she looked up at him longingly. I'm afraid, she whispered. Her traitorous body reminded her what showing fear had done in the past, her body, flying through the air, from the force of her husband's blow. The explosion of pain, the fear of more, her voice silenced, her vision dulled. Philemon's arms enfolded her. You have nothing to fear from me. I promise. Tell me what you wish for, and I shall grant it. Your own personal djinn. She managed to smile. Then can we kiss a little more? And then, can I sleep in your arms? He lifted her in his arms effortlessly. As you wish, princess. 34. Do you know how to pleasure a woman? With Anahita naked in his arms, Philemon struggled vainly to think of anything but what he wanted to do to her. Her words made him lose the battle. Oh yes. In many different ways, he began, wondering if he dared hope. With your fingers? Anahita asked. He'd forgotten she was a new bride on her as yet unconsummated wedding night. A bride who had never known a man's touch. He considered for a moment, before he decided to take the risk. Would you like me to show you? Yes, she said promptly. In the silence that followed his loss for words, she continued, when I can't sleep and the dreams return, it's the only way to distract my mind from the memories. If I'm asking too much, Philemon, merely say so and I will attempt to take care of myself. His imagination ran riot at the thought of her pleasuring herself in his arms, but the selfish part of him shut down that particular idea. She'd asked him for pleasure, and he intended to give it to her. You tell me if it is too much, he whispered, skimming his hand over her hip and between her thighs. She gave a little sigh, parting her legs wider as his fingers found the right spot. Philemon wrapped his other arm around her chest and pulled her firmly against him, reveling in the increasing tempo of her heartbeat, as his fingers worked the only magic he knew. Anahita began to moan softly, squirming in his grasp to drive his fingers deeper inside her. She ground her soft little ass against his groin, turning him hard as a rock. He'd give anything to slip more than his fingers inside her. Just one thrust. She bucked, arching her back away from him as she cried out, not once but twice, trapping his hand between her tightly clenched thighs. When the moment ended and she lay limp and panting in his arms, Anahita whispered, it's never felt that good before. Not even when Haidar. I'm a man, not a eunuch, Philemon snapped, fighting the jealousy curling up at the mention of the eunuch's name. How could she think of any other man when she lay, sated, in his arms? I know. She reached down and cupped him, and he was proud to realize it took both of her hands to do it. It took all of his self-control not to thrust into her warm hands and demand that she reciprocate. The bliss of those soft hands stroking him, or those wicked lips wrapped around him. Do you know how to pleasure a woman with this? Philemon grinned. Oh, she was a maiden all right. No woman who'd ever been loved by a man would have to ask such a question. 1,000 times better than with my hands, he assured her. He wanted to beg her to let him show her, but he knew that was too much to ask. She squirmed around so that she faced him, her oasis eyes fathomless pools in the darkness. If you can, I give you my word that you may share my bed every night until I return home. His breath caught in his throat. Was she really asking? Anahita took his hesitation for reluctance. And when we reach home, I will press my sister into finding the enchantress who cursed you, and making her break the curse. If you show me the pleasure you would show your bride on her wedding night. She moistened her lips. Please? He reached up to cup her face in his hands. On a wedding night the pleasure must be shared, he said, then kissed her. She stiffened at first, kissing was still too new to her, before Anahita melted into his touch, kissing him back with far more passion than he'd hoped for. 35. Philemon entered her slowly, as though terrified he would break her if he thrust too hard or fast. We only have until dawn, Anahita said, feeling it would be churlish to tell him to hurry up. He swallowed. I don't want to hurt you, and as this is your first time. She couldn't help it. She laughed. My first time? Truly you thought that? My first time, the bastard beat me so badly my eyes were nearly swelled shut, then cracked my head against the tent pole so I could not see him nor fight back when he raped me. I deserved the pain for tempting him so wickedly with my body, also he said. I learned later his man parts wouldn't work unless the woman he wanted was cowering in fear. I only wish he'd died more slowly than he did, for I know he deserved more pain than he ever put me through. She sobered. I was widowed for the 5th time tonight, but I will never let a man hurt me again. And if I fail to please you, you'll make me the 6th man to die at your feet? Hardly. You are not my husband. My father does not want you dead, and neither do I. You are a most agreeable traveling companion. Perhaps even more than that if you show me the pleasure you promised tonight. More pleasure than he had already. He nodded. Very well. And in one smooth motion he filled her completely. She took a deep breath, relishing the heat of him inside her, touching exactly where his fingers had stroked her to ecstasy not long before. Truly she wanted this. Wanted him. She didn't even need to say it. He looked into her eyes and saw it all, from that very first thrust until he pushed her all the way to an incredible peak where they cried out for joy together. And as he folded her into his arms afterwards, she pressed her ear to his chest, to hear his still racing heart beating in rhythm with hers. Will you love me like that again tomorrow night? She asked sleepily. Every night. I'll love you like that every night you desire, Philemon said. You should not say such things, you know, for after tonight, I will desire you every night as long as I live. She smiled. My prince? It will be my pleasure, princess. 36. Philemon awoke to the sweet smell of the soft girl in his arms, and for a moment, he wondered whether he had died in his sleep and flown direct to heaven. But Anahita was no houri. She was a living, breathing woman he would do anything to keep. A woman who deserved a proper husband, not one who would turn back into a frog when the sun rose. And she did not deserve to wake up beside his slimy self today, after the pleasures of last night. He should leave now and return to his hiding place among the water-skins to await their journey home. He must have jostled her, for her hand shot out and grabbed his arm. Don't go. Her oasis eyes reproached him. It is nearly dawn and you know what happens then, he said, pulling away. Make love to me once more. There is still time, she said. Philemon shook his head. Love-making should not be rushed. I will turn back into a frog before we are finished, and you will throw me out of your bed in disgust. Never, she declared, creeping closer. He tried not to moan as her hand wrapped around his length. You were thinking of it too. Love me like you want to. Despite his misgivings, he could not refuse her. And once their bodies joined, he was lost to anything but her pleasure and his own. Until she lay on the cushions, sated, her breasts heaving as she recovered from the exertion. Oh, how he loved her! Honored Sheikh, I bring food and water so that you may wash and break your fast. The women are waiting to tend to your wife too, when you are finished with her. Philemon recognized the man who'd handed him the knife last night, before he bowed deeply and hid his face. Philemon tugged a cloth up over Anahita's breasts, chagrined at the need to hide them from view. I will never be finished with her, he said honestly. Anahita gasped, but the man didn't seem to hear, for he ducked his head and said, I understand, honored Sheikh, but the men of the camp need your leadership. With Basset gone, they look to you, and it is nearly noon. The women, they too, need to know your orders. Basset beat them if they did not deliver the dinner he desired, and they do not wish to displease you. Noon. How was he still human if it was noon? His met Anahita's wide eyes. She recognized the significance, even if she understood it no better than he did. My wife will instruct them, he said, his eyes begging her to agree. A secretive smile twisted Anahita's lips, before she ducked her head to hide it. As my prince commands. Then the tent was full of women, helping Anahita wash and dress. Philemon rose, clutching a sheet to cover his modesty. One of the women bowed deeply. For you, honored Sheikh. She held out what appeared to be fresh robes. Oh, heavens be praised. He snatched them from her. He'd never dressed so quickly in his life. Yet as he reached the entrance of his tent, he hesitated. He had not stood in the sun in his own form for too long. Would the curse turn him green again once the sunlight touched him? Only one way to find out. Philemon stepped out into the sunlight, glad of his sandals as the very air seemed to want to sear his skin off. Honored Sheikh? The knife man stood uncertainly at his side. Enough of this sheikh business. Its Highness, actually. I'm Prince Philemon of Tasnim. Oh, it felt good to say it. Not as good as he'd felt twined around Anahita in the throes of passion, but it was a distant second. The man fell to his knees and touched his forehead to the burning sand. Oh, please forgive me, Your Highness. I did not know. He'd burn his face off if he stayed down there, Philemon knew. He seized the man's shoulder and hauled him to his feet. Of course you didn't, because I didn't tell you until now. What is your name? Tariq, Highness, the man said, not daring to raise his eyes to Philemon's face. So yesterday, who would you have expected to succeed Basset as sheikh? Philemon asked. I don't understand, Your Highness, Tariq said cautiously. Yesterday, your people couldn't wait to get rid of him. Who did you think would take his place? Philemon asked, watching Tariq's face carefully. Tariq hesitated, then said, Why, the strongest among us, the best leader, like yourself, Your Highness. Now Philemon wished he had been the one to kill Basset. A right fear-mongering bastard. I'm not staying, Tariq. I must return to Tasnim. I didn't leave the richest city in the world to come and lead a desert tribe. I'm not your new sheikh. Your people must choose their own leader. Philemon heard the man splutter behind him, but he no longer needed a guide. The tent where they'd held the wedding feast the previous day hummed with the sound of men's voices. Waiting for him. He marched in, calling for quiet. Philemon had to hide a smile when Tariq's voice rose to a roar, drowning out all other sound. Bow before His Royal Highness Prince Philemon of Tasnim. No bowing happened, but Philemon did get stunned silence. It was enough. He explained the things he'd told Tariq, and how he would be returning home as soon as possible. "And what about our wives?" one man shouted. "Are you taking them too?" Half a dozen others took up the same cry. Philemon sighed inwardly. He had no desire to lead any part of a desert tribe, or steal its women. "The only woman who will leave with me is the Sultan's daughter, Princess Anahita." A collective sigh of relief went up from the assembled men. "Where is she?" a familiar voice demanded. Philemon scanned the crowd and found them at the back, Anahita's men. They did not look relieved. "In the women's tent, I believe, seeing to our midday meal," Philemon said airily, as if it mattered little to him. "Ha!" His thoughts were with her every moment they were apart, though he knew she was in no danger with a pack of cowed women. "She'd better not be cooking it herself, or she'll poison us all." "I've seen the princess burn water," the man Assad shouted back. Nervous laughter erupted around him. Philemon cast his mind back. All those nights he'd traveled with them, had Anahita ever cooked anything? He couldn't recall her preparing any food, except occasionally skinning whatever that devilish bird of hers caught. He should have noticed her skill with a blade before. Too late now. Philemon mumbled something about making sure, and out of the tent toward the one where the women resided. A boy stood at the door. A guard, perhaps. His eyes widened when he saw Philemon and his mouth dropped open, no sound coming out. Philemon nodded and stepped into the dimly lit space. "The new sheikh. The new sheikh is here." The boy had regained the use of his voice. Philemon held up his hands in surrender. He knew better than to invade the domain of women without explaining himself first. "I seek Princess Anahita." "You could have waited until I'd finished bathing and I'd had something to break my fast," she grumbled as her head emerged from a tunic as heavily embroidered as the last two she'd worn. "After last night, I'm sure you don't need me again already." He couldn't help it. Just the sight of her brought a smile to his lips. How had he ever lived without her? "I will always need you." She narrowed her eyes. "And what about all your concubines, him?" "I have none and never will again. The only woman I will ever need now is you." Philemon wet his lips. "I will see you crowned as the Princess of Tasnim if you wish it." Anahita spread her arms wide. "And what of the other women here?" "Barsat made them all his concubines. They were wives' daughters, all stolen from their families." "What will you do with them, sheikh?" She spat the title like the worst epithet. Philemon shook his head. "I am no sheikh. I am Prince Philemon of Tasnim, and I declare you are free to return to your families as honorable widows, with all that entails. Any man who says otherwise will answer to me." Only now did he realize all eyes were upon him. "I told the guards this last night. Didn't they pass the message on?" Anahita's fingers laced through his. "I said the same thing, but no one believed me. See? I told you he is not a monster." She stared up at him, and for a moment he thought she would kiss him. Then her gaze darted down. "Except when he keeps me too busy for breakfast. I'm sure there is a law against denying a new bride her breakfast." A woman Philemon didn't know laid a hand on Anahita's shoulder. "Take the prince to one of the common tents. Congratulations to you both. I will bring a wedding breakfast for you." 37. In between bites of food and congratulations from what seemed like every man and woman in the camp at becoming their new sheikh, Anahita tried to ask him how he'd managed to break the curse. Philemon heard the question, she was certain of it, but he was too busy thanking someone to answer it right away. And then another interruption and another, until she wanted to scream if her throat still wasn't raw from last night. Finally, the tide of humanity seemed to decide to give them a moment alone. How did you break the curse? She demanded. He shrugged. I wish I knew. Perhaps it was you. I do not remember the witch's exact words when she first cursed me, but she definitely mentioned a princess's bed, and something about dusk or maybe dawn. If we find her, perhaps we can ask her. But in the meantime, I mean to enjoy being a man again. A man who will travel home with you as soon as possible if your word still holds true. It does, she said, stung. But why do you need to travel with us now? As the Prince of Tasnim and the sheikh of this place, surely you can command your people to come with you, or take you wherever you wish. He leaned close so his breath tickled her ear. I promise to take you to Tasnim, my home, and prove that I am its prince. The witch didn't just curse me, when she came the water supply dried up too. I must see it restored, even if it means hunting her down. I will help you, she said. Because if she could go to Tasnim, she could finally be free. Philemon took her hand in his and kissed it. And I will be grateful for any further assistance you wish to offer, princess. For after seeing you break one curse, I have no doubt you will save my city as you have me. Anahita wasn't sure about that, but another group of people came up to offer their congratulations, so she held her tongue. 38. Philemon would have given everything he owned to bypass the oasis without having to look at the accursed place, but his travel companions were having none of it. Besides, with the wells of Tasnim still dry, they would need to replenish their water supplies. He busied himself helping the other men unload the camels and set up camp. A task for servants, but Anahita had made it clear there were no servants or masters in this traveling party. A peculiar princess indeed. She stood at the water's edge, wearing a pair of flimsy sandals and a short tunic. They might have been the same ones she'd worn the day they met. Then she'd taken him in her hands, lifting him out of despondency and saving him from certain death. An irresistible desire rose up within him, to take her in his arms and never let her go. His feet carried him across the sand of their own accord, and she yielded to his embrace as she yielded to no one else. He pressed his lips to the back of her neck, tasting the salt of sweat she'd said she wanted to wash off. Why do you hesitate? He asked. Even he felt the pull of the cool water, which held no dread for him when he was with her. Anahita had broken the curse once, he was in no danger of being cursed again while he had her. The water is not as clear as before, and the level has risen. She pointed. Those baby date palms were well away from the edge before, but now they are submerged. Merlin insists there are frogs here too, where there were none but you last time we were here. And now the water is warm, which it wasn't the first time. She shook her head. I don't know what that means. He helped her out of her tunic and hurried to remove his own clothes. Then we should wash and wait for your bird to catch a frog. Perhaps you can question the creature. Anahita smiled. I have enough cursed princes to last me a lifetime. And I have no intention of sharing my bed with any man but you. He kissed her. Good. They took their time in the water, for washing soon led to other things, which meant more washing before they emerged. Moonrise in the twilight sky shimmered across Anahita's damp skin, before she slipped on a robe to cover herself. Dinner's ready, Assad called. Philemon hurried to don his own clothes, before heading to the fire, where the other three had already taken their seats. There must have been some rain in the mountains. We'll have to watch out for the rivers and be careful crossing them, Assad said. Philemon laughed. How can you possibly know that? I haven't seen a single cloud in the sky. The water here. It's been muddied by floodwaters, which only come when a deluge washes things down from the mountains. And the frogs, of course. That silly bird ate so many, she's too fat to fly anymore. Assad pointed at Anahita's falcon, who did look rounder than usual. He snorted. I hope none of them were your brothers, Philemon. She ate them while you two were taking your time in the water, and I don't speak frog. Anahita's blush was barely visible in the firelight, but there was no hiding it from Philemon or the other men who knew her so well. None of them spoke. Not like Philemon when Merlin caught him. They were ordinary frogs. Proper frogs, according to Merlin. She rose and headed over to the bird. Haidar tipped the dregs of his cup out onto the sand, then poured himself another drink. You may please her now, enough for her to accept you as her husband, but one wrong step and there are plenty of places where a body can be buried in the sand and never seen again. Don't forget that, Frog Prince. For a moment, Philemon wondered what it would be like to fight the man. A fair fight in the training ring, of course. Haidar was a better fighter than Anahita, and he had size and strength on his side too, but it would be a fine fight while it lasted. One Anahita would never allow, he was certain of it. Philemon lifted his cup in acknowledgement. And should I die in the desert at the point of the princess's blade, I thank you for the courtesy of a proper burial. For we both know you wouldn't deny her the pleasure of cutting out my heart, if that is her desire. Asad exploded into laughter. It's your manhood she'll cut off, and you'll live just long enough to watch it burn. Falling in love with her is foolishness. Haidar threw his cup down on the sand and stalked away, muttering to himself. Should you go after him? Philemon asked. Asad snorted. No. You're both as foolish as each other, and he knows it. But that doesn't alter the fact that he'll enjoy watching you die if you've lied to the princess about being a prince, or Tasnim. The one thing he loves almost as much as the girl herself is defending her honor. So if any part of your story isn't true, now's the time to disappear. Just take care at the river crossings, or your body will be swept away as easily as the princess has swept away your senses. I have lied about nothing, Philemon declared. Which is more than I can say about you. Whoever heard of storms in a clear sky? Where is all the water you say will cause a flood? Asad grinned, his eyes glittering in the firelight. Not all the water in the desert is where we can see it. Deep beneath the surface there are underground rivers and lakes. The same sort that lies beneath Tasnim and provides it with so much of its water. It bubbles up in wadis and springs like this one, but this is a mere puddle compared to what lies below. And with so much more water here, it'll be a wonder if your cave city isn't completely flooded. Philemon's heart constricted in his chest. Tasnim has never flooded. Never. The water is gone. It cannot flood. For if the treasure chambers on the lowest levels flooded, he would be penniless. The Sultan would not let him marry Anahita then. He swallowed. I will show you on the morrow. My city has survived for 1,000 years, and it will survive 1,000 more. Asad's smile didn't fade as he turned to stare into the fire. We shall see, Frog Prince. For a man who didn't know about the rivers beneath the desert a moment ago, you'll forgive me if I don't believe your expert assessment of them now. 39. Philemon's frantic lovemaking last night spoke of some emotional disquiet he refused to tell her. Fear had his eyes darting everywhere, above a mouth that couldn't seem to smile as they approached his home. It was a strange transformation. All the way to Barset's camp, he'd entertained Anahita with tales of the beauties of Tasnim, but now he seemed terrified to show them to her. Determined to solve this mystery before she arrived, Anahita urged her camel to match Philemon's pace. Her happy travel companion was now too busy scowling at the horizon to notice her. Tell me about your last day in Tasnim, she said. He glanced up for only a moment before the horizon drew his gaze once more. Is that an order? We made a deal. You amuse me while we travel and I take you home. Well, I don't find your silence amusing. I find it alarming. And I want to know what I'm walking into. Sometimes knives are not enough. Especially if there is an enchantress who turns innocent princes into frogs. Anahita managed a smile. I'm hardly innocent. She will not touch you. If she even attempts to cast a spell in your direction, I shall. Philemon stopped, then continued, I shall stand in her way and force her to curse me instead. In the meantime, your men will use her distraction to deal with her. And then I will have to break the curse again, though I don't know how I did it the first time. You place great faith in me. Faith I don't share. Tell me what happened. What are we walking into that has you so scared? Anahita pressed. Philemon sighed deeply and buried his head in his hands. There is nothing in Tasneem that will harm you. Not even her. I am not innocent either. I fear I may have deserved the curse, and if there is anyone in Tasneem, they will blame me for the fall of the city too. Anahita persisted. But you can't possibly be responsible for the wells running dry. It would take a powerful curse or spell or... It was a wish, granted by a particularly powerful jinn, actually. A careless wish that once granted could not be undone. Now Philemon refused to meet her eyes at all. But Anahita would not be diverted from her course. What did you wish for? He let out a harsh laugh. What does any man wish for in the desert? An oasis where he might drink and refresh himself. When Anahita didn't respond, he went on, the oasis where you found me actually. A place where you could not resist bathing either. And the tale came spilling out, at first in spurts and starts, before finally it gushed out of Philemon, a flow of words that could not be stopped. A jinn who obeyed orders without question, creating an oasis for his master without caring about the consequences. A city slowly starved of water until the wells ran dry. A prince who demanded the oh-so-powerful jinn fix the problem, only to be told it required more power than the jinn possessed, to refill the underwater reservoir. A call for help, the help of a powerful enchantress, who did have the power to compel the jinn to obey. An enchantress who imprisoned the jinn, but who could not return the water to his home. A fool of a prince who threw the enchantress out of the city unthanked and unpaid, for she had not restored his city's water supply. A city of people trying to leave and an enraged enchantress who could not be kept out. An enchantress who cast him into a well, then led the evacuation herself, saving his people. A fool of a prince, turned frog, hopping from puddle to puddle as he chased what remained of his city's water supply, all the way down to the new oasis, where he finally understood, no magic in the world was powerful enough to make water run uphill. Or to change the past. But it's not your fault, Anahita said slowly. It is, Philemon insisted. I made that foolish wish and I am the city's prince. The responsibility is mine. I know that now. But the jinn. He should have said something. Philemon shook his head. You don't know jinn. They are slaves bound by magic to obey their masters without question. The only time they can refuse is if they are not powerful enough to grant their master's wish. Something I realized too late. I made the wish, so the responsibility for it is mine. Tasneem was a city of wonders, and she died of thirst in the desert because of me. Then what are you afraid of? Anahita still didn't understand. Philemon reached out and grabbed her hand. Her startled eyes met his, and an intensity she could not look away from. Have you ever killed a man who didn't deserve it? He demanded. Of course not. All of them were bastards. Men who killed innocent men and women, not caring who they destroyed as they pursued their desires. They deserved far worse than I gave them, I promise you. Anahita tried to pull her hand back, but he held it fast. What do you think I did to Tasneem? I destroyed a city to grant the most insignificant desire. How am I any better than the rest of them? You should have killed me then, but you'll definitely do it when you see the ghost my beautiful city has become. He released her and urged his camel into a gallop, putting space between them. Anahita had no way to close. It was for the best. Few people had seen Anahita cry, and if the desert drank her tears, no one would ever know how her heart wept for Philemon and all he had lost. Because he was wrong. He was nothing like Fari or Bassett or any of the others. None of them had ever showed a moment of remorse for their actions, or even regret. And as the tears dried on her cheeks in the searing desert heat, she made a new vow. Men might die, but a city's life was in her people. If she could help Philemon return Tasnim to its former glory, then she would do everything in her power to make that happen. Because to turn Philemon the frog into the true prince he deserved to be, he needed his domain back. His home. 40. Philemon touched the stone that marked the gates of Tasnim. 20 men could not move it, but when he laid his hand on it, it rolled aside as though it weighed nothing. Part of the enchantments the door guardian had laid on the place, in the centuries he had watched over the city. The silence struck him first. The city should be bustling, but it was empty. Of people, of movement, of life. He had done this. Perhaps he should not show this to Anahita now. He wanted her to see the city at its best, not the empty shell of what it once was. But without her help, how could he ever bring it back to life? Reluctantly, he led the way inside. Anahita's fingers found his, lacing them together as she stood at his side. So this is the legendary city of Tasnim. It looks like a sandstorm came through, and the people are just waiting for it to be safe before they sweep the sand away. Sand, not water. Assad's predictions of flooding had not come to pass. He breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. For the sand was deeper than he'd ever seen it. More than one sandstorm had done this. The air vents and light wells couldn't keep the desert out for long, but it was piled up in drifts against the walls, leaving swathes of stone floor clear to walk across. How long had he been gone? There was no way of telling down here. Unlike the sand, time had stood still. He led the way to the well by which he'd last left the city. A quick peek into the houses along the way revealed little. They'd been left as if their owners had simply gone on a journey, and intended to return. The beds were made up, ready for their owner's return, and some kitchens still had bags and casks of food in them, waiting to be opened for the next meal. The well hadn't changed a bit. He must have already been a frog when he fell in, Philemon decided. He knelt down beside the low stone wall that normally kept people from falling in, and scrabbled around in the sand. He unearthed a robe. When he shook the sand out of it, he recognized it as the one he'd been wearing that fateful day. If his clothes were here, then his ring of office must be too, and the door guardian Jinn. Desperately he sifted through the sand searching, but no ring emerged. He'd come back later and search, he promised himself. Didn't you say the water is all gone? Anahita asked. Yes, Philemon admitted. We will find a way to bring it back. If such a thing was possible. But I can hear it, she insisted. She knelt, took a pebble from the floor, and threw it into the well. They both heard it plop into water that sounded too deep to be true. With shaking hands, Philemon lowered his torch as far as he could without falling in. Again. Light gleamed on the water not far below. It's real. It's returned, he blurted out. He dropped his torch on the ground, wrapped both arms around her, and kissed her. You did it. I don't know how, but you did. He kissed her again and again. He never wanted to stop. I didn't do anything, she protested. And the water might be back, but where are your people? Do they know the waters have returned? He reluctantly turned his mind to more mundane matters. No, they must not. I must go to the capital and find criers willing to shout it from the rooftops that Tasnim citizens can come home. The capital. She did not sound so eager to go home as he thought she'd been. Of course. We must also buy provisions, for I am sure the people took what they could when they left. This didn't lift her frown at all. Would you like to see the fabled jeweled gardens of Tasnim? Words cannot describe their beauty, you must see them with your own eyes to fully appreciate them. A small smile graced her lips. I've heard so much about them. Taking her hand, he led the way to the harem gardens, wishing with all his heart that he would find a way to make this her home. He stepped into the hall that held the most wondrous trees known to man, lifting his torch so that she might see them better. And stopped. What bastard stole my garden? Philemon roared. 41. It took time to calm Philemon down and persuade him that the capital was probably the best place to start looking for the thief, though Anahita suspected that the jewels and precious metals had most likely been melted down and made into smaller, more portable things by now. Nevertheless, he agreed, and within 2 days, they'd reached the capital. A city that changed little, usually. That went up quickly. I didn't know father intended to build a new palace, and we haven't been gone that long. Do you remember hearing anything about this edifice? Anahita asked, peering through the gleaming gates of the brand new palace. Haidar shrugged. Nothing at all. Palaces take years to build, not weeks. I smell magic at work. Magic that could erect a palace in a matter of weeks was potent stuff indeed. Whoever had built this place was more powerful than anyone Anahita had ever met. Haidar exchanged a few words with the guard, then returned to Anahita's side, his frown deeper than ever. He said this palace belongs to the Prince of Tasnim and his wife, Princess Maram. Anahita's mouth dropped open beneath her veil. Maram will never marry, and the Prince of Tasnim is? She waved at Philemon. Not about to tolerate impostors, Philemon said softly, marching toward the gate with murder in his eyes. No, wait, Anahita said. If Maram has truly married the man, she would never refuse to see me. Or the men with me, for she knows I am never without Haidar and Asad. She turned to Haidar. Tell him who I am and that I wish to seek consolation for my bereavement with my sister. Haidar bowed low, hiding his grin. As your highness wishes. While they waited for a guard to find out if Maram was willing to see her sister, Anahita lowered her voice to share her plan. Haidar, Asad, return to the palace and see that my things are taken where they belong. Have the servants prepare an evening meal for me, for I will be home then. Philemon can accompany me as my guard. She laid a hand on his arm, shooting him a meaningful glance, until we know more. When the time is right, then reveal yourself and lay the impostor bare. Philemon inclined his head. Spoken like a true assassin. Anahita hushed him, scanning the people around to see if anyone had heard. Thankfully, no one appeared to have been listening. The gates swung open and both guards bowed. Princess Maram welcomes Princess Anahita to her home. Anahita recognized the maid who met them at the door. Yasmin? So Maram really is here? Yasmin bowed. Yes, Princess. This palace was a gift to Her Highness from her new husband. He even built her a bathhouse so that she might not need to cross the city to use the one by the gates. She still does, of course, but not every day now. She giggled. Her Highness does not like to leave her husband. So Maram is happy to be married? Anahita ventured. I have never seen Her Highness happier. Yasmin's tone was rich with satisfaction. She definitely approved of Maram's marriage. And what of her husband? The master is most kind. Master. An interesting title for a man who styled himself as a prince. Whoever he was wealthier than her own father, for this palace was grander inside than out. Quite a feat. His wealth must have been what swayed the Sultan to let Maram marry. But it would not have won over Maram. And unlike most other women in the harem, Maram would not have confided her secrets to her maid. So Anahita followed Yasmin in silence, admiring the mosaics that rose from the floor to cover the walls and the ceiling. Whoever he was, he had an eye for detail and beauty, to command such work for Maram. Perhaps he truly loved her. What man wouldn't? Philomon's footsteps echoed angrily behind her, more stomps than steps. A quick glance back told her he had noticed the wealth they walked within, and it only inflamed his temper further. A man who could build such a place had no need to pretend to be a prince. He could have bought himself a small kingdom somewhere with the price he'd have paid for this palace alone. Then why? Maram rose to greet them, her hair flowing like a dark river over her shoulders and her cerise silk gown. What are you still wearing your veil for? Maram chided, reaching for Anahita's face. Your husband, I thought. Anahita stammered. Maram clucked her tongue. No need to worry about him. You are among family here. A hand seized Maram's wrist before she could touch Anahita. No one touches Princess Anahita without the princess's permission, Philemon rumbled warningly. Maram's eyes flared blue as they turned her gaze on Philemon. But to touch Princess Maram is to lose your heart and mind in love for her, for you are not one of her usual men. Are you? She lifted her captured wrist and spun in his grasp, a graceful dancer's twirl that highlighted her perfect figure as the silk swirled around her. Is he why you won't uncover your face, Anna? For he's no eunuch, see? Maram pointed. Philemon released Maram and seized Anahita instead, pulling her body against his to shield her from Maram? Now Anahita couldn't help but notice his arousal, for it grew harder still with the close contact. Stand back, witch. Your foul spell will not work on me. I love only one woman and no witch will tear her from me. Philemon ripped his sword from its scabbard, and pointed it at Maram. Back, I said. After the enchantress who'd cursed him, he could see no good in any magic wielder. He would cut her down, he feared her magic that much. No. This couldn't happen. Not Maram. Her blades were in her hands before Anahita had time to think. One at Philemon's throat, while a second aimed for a lower target. Drop your sword or you'll lose the other one, Anahita said. Tears welled up, but she stood firm. No matter how much she loved him, she would not let Philemon hurt her sister. Anna! His eyes widened with betrayal. I swore an oath. Hurt her and you are no better than Barset. And you shall share his fate. She begged him with her eyes. Drop your sword. 42. Philemon could not refuse her. He let the blade clatter to the floor. Anahita kicked it out of reach. Get out. He stared at her. Surely she couldn't mean that. Is there anything you wish of me, my princess? A new voice asked. He stood in the doorway to the courtyard, too well dressed to be a servant, yet not proud enough to be a prince. This lean man reminded him of a desert hunting falcon, tamed and kept hungry to serve one of the desert camps, waiting for his mistress's command. The witch favored him with a beaming smile. My sister's man needs some air. Perhaps you could take him into the garden. He might find it cooler under the trees. The man returned her smile and bowed deeply. Not like a servant. More like he was mocking her. He was the witch's lover, Philemon realized. As you wish, princess. He turned to the side and gestured toward Philemon. Please be my guest. Philemon risked a glance back at Anahita, but her eyes still blazed with fury. She hadn't sheathed her knives. Philemon sighed. Very well. He followed the witch's lover. Men who threaten Maram tend to die gruesome deaths. You are the first she has ever invited to see her garden, the man said over his shoulder. Perhaps it is because you are a man of the desert. The laws of hospitality are strong in the camps, or so I am told. She must be curious to discover what would make a man forget something so fundamental. Philemon glanced down at his clothes, for the first time realizing what he must look like. He was dressed like a desert sheikh. Had they mistaken him for Anahita's dead husband? "I am not what I appear. I am in fact a man of Tasnim," Philemon said. The witch's lover nodded slowly. A city known for the high price of its hospitality. A faint smile touched his lips. "Have you been there?" Philemon demanded. "Once. I have no desire to return. It is a desolate place." The witch's lover dismissed it with a shrug of his shoulder. Philemon bristled. "Now the waters have returned, so will its people. Tasnim will live again. I swear it." Spoken like a man who loves his home and knows it is only home because of the people in it. "I almost lost everything before I came to realize that. Without Maram I am nothing." Another shrug, as though this man didn't care that his happiness depended on a woman, and a witch at that. "No man is nothing. Return with me to Tasnim and I will show you that no man is worthless," Philemon said. The man looked amused. "You would turn me into a man of Tasnim?" Philemon opened his mouth to correct him, for the right to live in Tasnim was earned, not granted, except in the most unusual circumstances. Like saving the life of the prince, or some other such act of courage and service. "Behold, the princess's garden." The man turned to the side to let Philemon precede him. "Have you ever seen anything so wondrous?" Philemon stepped from darkness into light, and what a wondrous light it was. Fractured rainbows blinding, glittering from every angle both above and below. He shaded his eyes, squinting to find the source of so much light. The noon sun gazed down from above, but there was more to it. It was like standing in a cage of mirrors, or... Philemon's heart turned to a burning lump of lead in his chest, firing his blood to boiling. "These are the jeweled gardens from the harem of Tasnim. Your master stole these from me. Tell me his name and I will grant you full citizenship of my city. He will die for this." He reached for his sword, but the scabbard was empty. Too late, he realized he'd left the blade behind at Anahita's command, when he needed it now. "You stole these. You visited my city. How?" A blue cloud erupted between Philemon and the witch's lover. "My master is no thief, Philemon. I took them as my due, a price for service as it were. And I was right to do so. Their splendor in sunlight is unmatched. You left them to be buried in dust and blown sand. My greatest creation." The Jinn door guardian spat on the floor at Philemon's feet. "You did not deserve them." "Kave, that is no way to treat a guest in my house," the man chided. "He means you harm, he threatened your life just as he drew his sword on the princess," the Jinn insisted. Realization dawned on Philemon. "You're not the witch's lover. She's your wife, you're the man who was not content to just pretend to be a prince. My name, my garden, my door guardian. What else have you stolen from me?" The man pulled a ring off his finger, a ring Philemon recognized. "I did not." "No," the Jinn howled, shoving the ring back on his master's finger. "You swore an oath. That ring is not to leave your finger until you pass it to your son on your deathbed." A Jinn fighting his master? Philemon would not have believed such a thing was possible if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. Philemon held out his hand. "That is my ring of office. I demand you hand it over along with mastery of that disobedient Jinn." The Jinn glared back at him. "You cast the ring aside along with everyone else in the city when you deserted us. Fadi sold that ring to a silversmith so that he would have the money to feed your people. An evil wizard bought it and gave it to Aladdin. It belongs to him and you shall not have it." Philemon ignored him. The fake prince was the key, he knew it. What had the Jinn said his name was? "Aladdin, give me my ring or I will tell your wife who is the real prince of Tasnim." Let's see if Princess Maram wishes to be your wife when she knows the truth. Please enlighten me, a female voice purred. The witch. Philemon reached for his dagger. Oh, don't bother, she said. She's gone home to her apartments in the Sultan's palace, and you've made your preferences perfectly clear. You fancy my sister, and against her better judgment and my own, she's still partial to you. She's never taken a lover before. She's more likely to take a man's life than take him to bed. You must have been quite persuasive, Prince Philemon of Tasnim. Philemon sagged. Not persuasive enough if she has left me. Aladdin had the right of it. The world was empty without the woman he loved. He stared at the fake prince with sympathy for the first time. The jinn had vanished. Perhaps not. The witch wet her lips. Would you care for a wager, Philemon? What do you have that I want? The witch smiled. By the sound of things, everything. Your garden. Your title. Your symbol of office. And the woman you wish to be your wife. She had him. What do I have that you want? Philemon asked, his heart sinking. He was back to promising all the wealth of Tasnim to a witch. If she turned him into a frog again, Anahita would not save him this time, he was sure of it. The power to make my dearest sister happy, she said. Her eyes filled with tears. I would gamble my garden for that. Philemon drew closer. What do you mean? Maram waved her hand and a servant appeared. Bring us refreshments. We have business to discuss. The maid scurried away. Maram gazed into Philemon's eyes. A frank assessment of his soul, without a hint of the seduction she'd tried earlier. You will go speak to the Sultan, and you will tell them Aladdin is your younger half-brother. And then you will tell him that seeing your brother's happiness, you must be married to another of my sisters at once. Philemon shook his head. Anahita will never agree to it. You didn't see the way she looked at me. Maram wet her lips. That is where the wager comes in. If this works, she will be your wife, and I keep my garden. If this does not work, I will ask my husband to have another garden crafted for you to replace this one. Do we have a deal? Hope danced before Philemon, like Anahita on her wedding night. Tantalizing but too far away to touch. And if she decides she wants me dead instead? Maram laughed. If my sister wanted you dead, you'd be lying in a pool of your own blood in my reception room. Anahita does not hesitate, or she didn't before you. Could he gamble everything for love? He stared at Aladdin, the pretend prince, who only had eyes for Maram. Her dark eyes were firmly fixed on Philemon. Yes, Philemon said. Yes, we have a deal. 43. The moment the men vanished, Maram tore the veil from Anahita's head. Where did he hurt you? She demanded, examining Anahita's face. Anahita shook her head. He didn't. Philemon has been everything I ever dreamed of, until he threatened you. That's not Sheikh Basit? Maram asked. No. Basit was old, fat, boring and a bastard. He's also dead and buried. Philemon even tried to take the blame. Basit's people believed him. Because no one believed a woman was capable of defending herself, or killing a dangerous man. Least of all the men who died at her hands. So who is he, and where did you find him? Maram asked. The Prince of Tasnim, as a frog perched atop her hawk's head, soaring and screaming above an oasis. Anahita shook her head. You won't believe me. Maram smiled. Would you believe I married a humble spinner's son, a man so poor he could scarcely afford to eat, who wandered into the wrong bathhouse? Anahita's mouth dropped open. You mean, you married your lover from the bathhouse? I thought he was supposed to be a prince. Maram pressed a finger to her lips. Father thinks so, which is why he agreed to the marriage. The palace helped though. How did a man who couldn't afford food pay for this palace? Anahita asked slowly. A particularly powerful jinn built it. He served Aladdin for a time, but now he is free. Dread curled around Anahita's heart. Jinn are dangerous. Especially powerful ones. A jinn was responsible for the wells drying up in Tasnim. They grant wishes with no thought as to the consequences, and do not care to repair the damage they cause. If a jinn built this palace, then there is surely trouble coming. Where did he get the building materials, the artisans? You cannot trust a jinn. Maram's smile only widened. I trust this one. He was a friend of my mother's. He would not make trouble for me, and now he is free, I trust him even more. Not all jinn are troublemakers. It is their masters who make the trouble, Amani told me, for jinn are slaves to their master's will. Philemon's words on the way to Tasnim began to make sense. So if a jinn's former master said the ruin of Tasnim was his fault, then… Maram shrugged. He's probably right. But Tasnim is not ruined, it's merely deserted. Locked up and hard to get into, Aladdin said. I've seen it, Anahita said. He's right. But now the water has returned to the wells, the people can return, and Philemon. He's handsome, your Philemon. What sort of lover is he? Maram demanded. Anahita felt her cheeks grow hot. I have little to compare him to, but I think he is a fine lover. Anahita broke off at Maram's laughter. You mean he truly is your lover? Ah, never have I been so mistaken. First I thought him the sheikh, then another lovesick eunuch to join the others. I am sorry I tried to seduce him. Maram looked suitably contrite, before her gaze turned thoughtful. Though I have never been threatened at sword point to stop seducing a man. Usually they don't want me to stop. Instead, he grabbed you and professed his love for you. You've caught a strange one there, Anna. Does he have other peculiarities, perhaps? She should never have drawn her blades. Not on Philemon. He'd been defending her, defending their love. I told him to go away. Anahita burst into tears. He said he loved me and I sent him away. But he didn't go far. I've known a lot of men, and if he'd wanted to leave you, he would have. He'll come to find you soon enough. Perhaps you should head home to Father's palace and wash away the travel dust, so that you can greet him properly when he does. She glanced toward the garden. Aladdin will keep him occupied until then. Her husband. Philemon. Tasnim. Anahita grasped Maram's arm. But Philemon is the real prince of Tasnim, and he thinks your husband is an impostor pretending to be him. He wanted to kill him. Maram paled. Then go. I will broker a peace between them. Diplomacy is my strength, after all. Wash, rest and wait. She ordered some guards to take Anahita to the palace, before hurrying out to the garden. Anahita longed to stay, but short of fighting her way through Maram's men, a feat she doubted she'd manage without Haidar and Asad to help her, she had little choice but to go home with them and hope her sister was right. Maram was rarely wrong, but if this was the one time, Anahita might never see Philemon again. She prayed her sister had not lost her touch with men or diplomacy. For Anahita's heart depended on both. 44. Philemon took a deep breath as he surveyed the Sultan's audience chamber. He knew this was just a formality, for the Sultan's matchmaker had agreed to the marriage long before he turned frog, but that didn't stop his heart from leaping into his throat in fear if something went wrong. But it would not. He was a prince, a true prince, unlike Aladdin, and a fitting husband for any princess. Or so he told himself. A commotion at the gate told him Aladdin's servants had arrived, with his gift. The crowd parted, waves of an ancient sea at the command of a prophet. Or a prince. A gift to the Sultan from His Royal Highness Prince Philemon of Tasnim, the door guardian Jin Kaveh roared, his voice perfectly pitched to resonate through the hall. Not for the first time, Philemon regretted losing the loyalty of the ancient vizier. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. "Where is this prince?" the Sultan demanded. "Tell him to show his face so that I may thank him for such a handsome gift." It was identical to what he'd received from Aladdin in exchange for permission to marry Maram, even down to the livery of the servants. The Sultan was not fool enough to refuse it. But Philemon was not Aladdin, he needed no fanfare or parade to announce his presence. A true prince commanded attention, or he did not deserve his crown. Philemon strode into the archway that marked the boundary between the dim throne room and the dazzling desert daylight. He stood in the light, silhouetted against the morning sun. "I am here. I have come to claim my bride, a daughter of the Sultan, to become the new princess of Tasnim." The crowd buzzed, but they did not hinder his march toward the dais where the Sultan sat. When Philemon reached the row of prostrate servants presenting their gifts of gold and jewels, he stopped and bowed. Just low enough for his eyes to meet those of the seated Sultan. The Sultan looked shaken. Because of Aladdin, Philemon guessed. "When I saw how happy my younger half-brother Aladdin was with his wife, I refused to wait any longer. I must marry, and it must be one of your daughters," Philemon continued. If this didn't work, Philemon vowed he'd force Aladdin to confess the truth at the point of his sword, no matter what his witch of a wife wanted. In the shadows behind the Sultan's throne, a woman leaned forward and whispered something into the Sultan's ear. He gave the slightest nod, then rose. "This audience is at an end for today. I will hear more petitions on the morrow. I will meet privately with the Prince of Tasnim," the Sultan announced. The court slowly emptied until the golden doors closed with a clunk of finality. Only then did the woman step out of the shadows. Her gown, which Philemon had taken for plain black, glittered in the light, for the wine-colored linen was embroidered with jewels. The Sultan did not miss Philemon's interest in the mysterious woman. "If you wish to discuss marriage, my matchmaker must be present. She knows which of my daughters are suitable." Philemon nodded. The woman hadn't been so richly dressed when he last met her, but it made sense to have her there. Though he would be the judge of who was suitable, not her. The matchmaker led the way into the palace proper, choosing a chamber that was better suited to an intimate discussion than the audience hall. One more richly furnished than the place where he'd first met with the woman, if indeed this was the same one. For the matchmaker he'd met here before hadn't swished her hips quite that seductively as she walked. Nor had she been the first to sit on the floor cushions, as this one did. She'd surprised the Sultan too, Philemon noticed, hiding his grin. Philemon and the Sultan took their seats and servants brought in refreshments, before departing at a signal from the matchmaker. This door clicked shut so quietly, Philemon was barely aware of it. The woman threw off her veil and reached for a cup of wine. "Maram." Her haughty brows furrowed when she found both men staring at her. "He's family, father. Aladdin's brother. Perhaps if we find him a wife, he'll learn to stop staring at women's faces when he is fortunate enough to see one." She sipped from her wine cup, then shot a red-lipped smile in Philemon's direction. "If my brother-in-law can tell us what he wants in a wife, perhaps I can help him." "I want Anahita," he blurted out, closing his eyes to better resist the spell she seemed to cast simply by looking at him. The Sultan cleared his throat. "My daughter Anahita is in mourning, for she has only recently been widowed. It will be some time before she is ready to wed again, if ever." "And the daughter of a mere concubine, hardly fitting for such an important prince," Maram interjected. "I am sure one of Masa, the Moon Queen's daughters, would be far better suited. She has 2 daughters of marriageable age, Katayun and Marvash. Marvash is the image of her mother, sweet and obedient, and likely just as fertile. Catiun has been well trained by her mother in the practicalities of running a harem, and well able to keep your other wives and concubines in order. I have heard tales that the Prince of Tasnim's harem rivals my father's own, and a young virile man like yourself without an heir. I want Anahita, Philemon repeated. I want her as my wife and no one else. Now. He wished the woman wasn't here. Her very presence set his teeth on edge and made him most irritable. Left alone with the Sultan, he would not have announced his desire so directly, nor demanded it. There would have been conversation, negotiation, but the witch wanted him to fail. Why else would she be making this so difficult? But her husband has only just died, Maram snapped, eyeing him with considerable irritation. If he failed, he'd get his harem garden back, but what use was it without Anahita? What use was anything without her? Last night, Maram had insisted if he followed her plan, he would win Anahita back. Now it was as though last night had never happened. Or was this woman one of Maram's sisters, identical in appearance to Maram, but not the same person? If she wasn't Maram, then he had nothing to fear from her. Philemon rose to his feet. I am her husband, by the laws of the desert people. Sheikh Basset's death frightened her and she refused to be left alone. She shared my tent that night, and the marriage was sealed by a wedding breakfast at dawn the next day. I will not leave the city until you return my wife to me. A wicked smile appeared on the woman's face, which dissolved into a shocked expression as quickly as it had appeared. But one of the Sultan's virtuous daughters could not. It was Philemon's turn to smile. She already carries my child. And the child will be born in Tasnim, as the heir to the principality should be. It was possible, therefore not entirely a lie. Maram's eyes danced with mischief, for this woman could be no one else. How do you know it is not Sheikh Basset's baby in her belly? Philemon drew himself up. Because I slew the man myself before the consummation could occur. You killed him? The Sultan stared. If Philemon had ever doubted Anahita was her father's assassin, the doubts died then and there. He encroached on Tasnim's territory, attacking towns that were under my protection, and we do not treat such things lightly. Philemon allowed the Sultan a small smile. I'm sure if you were in my position, you would have done the same. The Sultan looked thoughtful for a moment, before turning to Maram. Fetch her, he commanded. Maram obeyed. Once the door had shut behind her, the Sultan poured himself a cup of wine and gestured for Philemon to do the same. I had heard that Tasnim's wells ran dry. Philemon's mouth was drier. They did, but the waters have returned, sweeter and more plentiful than ever, he managed to say. He poured, then drank. Tasnim is a worthy ally for anyone who wishes to travel and trade across the desert. So it is. But what if you were to suffer some misfortune? Who would be the ruler of Tasnim then? The Sultan asked. The city will pass to the child my wife carries, Philemon said slowly. A child cannot hold a city, especially an unborn one. Surely your brother would inherit instead. Brother? Oh, Aladdin. Hence my need for a wife. One who has proven fertile already, Philemon managed to say, feigning nonchalance to cover the chill that had crept over his heart. Did the Sultan intend to have him assassinated, so that Aladdin could steal the city? But the Sultan's assassin was... Anahita. Good. I have some questions for you, child, the Sultan said. Anahita stood awkwardly before the closed door, staring at her father. Yes, father? Who killed Sheikh Basset? The Sultan demanded. Anahita wet her lips. Why, Prince Philemon, of course. It was terrifying to see him strike the blow. Ask anyone in Basset's camp. The Sultan seemed surprised, then relieved. Because his daughter hadn't killed a man? No, because Philemon didn't know that she had, Philemon decided. Are you carrying his child? Philemon closed his eyes. 45. Are you carrying his child? The Sultan repeated. Anahita shot a dark glance at Maram. Damn her spies. Yes, Anahita admitted. The midwife confirmed it this morning. Philemon's child, not Barsit's, but she could not tell her father that. Nor Philemon, while her father was listening. Take the girl then, the Sultan said. I wish you well of her. Philemon rose and took her arm. Thank you. Anahita found herself in the corridor with Philemon. What are you? She began. You are my wife and I am taking you home, he interrupted, heading down the corridor as though he knew where he was going. Anahita wrenched free. What are you doing? The harem's that way, and even if my father has given me to you like some bauble, he will not let you have any of his own wives and concubines. Then how do we get out of this palace? Philemon looked bewildered. Anahita took pity on him. This way, she said. Behind her, she heard the familiar footsteps of Haidar and Asad as they followed her, and she breathed a sigh of relief. No matter what her father said, she would never be some prince's plaything. If you know the way to a good inn, that would help too, Philemon said softly, glancing around. Asad will know the best, she said. But I have apartments here in the palace, and my sister Maram has spies everywhere, Philemon finished. A flash of understanding sparked between them. Asad will lead the way and Haidar will make sure we are not followed, Anahita said. The two men moved into place, setting a steady pace that moved easily through the busy streets. Philemon was stiff and agitated at her side, but he didn't say another word until they were behind the closed door of the best room in what Asad insisted was the most prestigious inn in the city. Your father and your sister want you to kill me so her husband can have Tasnim, Philemon said. He pulled his knife from its sheath and flipped it so it lay hilt first in his hand. Take it and use it now. I would rather die at this very moment than to be stabbed in the back when I believed I was happy. Anahita stared at the knife and then him in horror. I don't know of any such plan. Maram would never want Tasnim, for it is too isolated for her. She'd be bored without harem and court politics to play with. The Sultan made it clear he wants my city. He wanted to know all about the succession, should some misfortune befall me. Anahita touched her belly. How did you know about the baby? Even I didn't know for sure until this morning. I guessed. I lied. I don't know. Philemon exploded. He wasn't going to let me marry you, and then, suddenly, he changed his mind and handed you to me. Like merchants trade their daughters for Tasnim's hospitality. I would have carried you to the city as its princess, a ruler who would sit at my side, but not like this. He thrust the knife at her hilt first. Do it. If you are truly his assassin, cut out my heart. For it cannot hurt as much as it does now, knowing the woman I love will kill me. He tore open his shirt baring his breast. Anahita seized the knife and flung it point down into the floor. I will not, she said fiercely. I am not my father's assassin. I killed men who deserved their fate, animals who would have killed me given the chance. You are not like them, and I will not help anyone who tries to take Tasnim from you. He was the one talking of heartache, yet hers felt like it was ready to break. Her father has used her as a pawn to destroy his enemies, but she would no longer play politics. That was Maram's world, not hers. And if Maram could marry, so could she. She stared into Philemon's eyes. Marry me, she said. And then take me home to Tasnim with you. He dropped his gaze and her heart sank with it. Please, she begged, then kissed him. The fire built between them, burning as bright as their first kiss. He wanted her, Anahita knew that. But then why? He set his hands on her shoulders and broke the kiss. I cannot marry you because we are already married. His eyes begged her to understand. She shook her head. We can't be. I'd remember. Still he didn't smile. By the laws of the desert people, when a couple share a tent for the night and share a morning meal afterward, they are married. The night Sheikh Bassett died. He shook his head. In the panic of that night, I forgot what I should have known. And with you in my arms, I lost my mind entirely. You are everything I ever wished for in a wife, and more. I should have left you alone that night, but I could not resist you. Memories of that first night brought a blush to Anahita's cheeks. She had not been able to resist him either, nor had she wanted to. As for letting her sleep in that tent alone, Anahita had begged him to stay when he'd suggested leaving. Realization dawned. That's how we broke the curse. The very night she'd vowed to do anything Philemon needed to break it, she already had. Perhaps. It was my first curse and I hope my last. Philemon drew in a deep breath. So, you aren't angry at me for wedding you without you being aware of it? Without asking for your consent to the match? He rushed to continue before she could respond. If you are, say the word and I will divorce you, though it would break my heart to do so. I could not force you into a match you do not desire. No, you wouldn't. She remembered the passion of that first night, and every night after. Until last night's loneliness, not knowing if she would ever see him again. I came to you willingly, Philemon. Every night since, and so I intend to continue. Together, with you. No talk of divorce or cutting out hearts. I am your wife. I am your wife. The word tasted good on her lips. My one and only. Now his smile appeared and it was blindingly bright. His arm slid around her, pulling her close. His kiss held the promise of everything she'd ever wanted. She laid her head against his bare chest, where his heartbeat thrummed under her cheek. Take me home to Tasnim, my frog prince. Anything for the princess who saved me. 46. Here she is, your highness, a man's voice said. Not Haidar or Assad. Anahita settled Vega on her glove and turned to face the newcomer. She had to look up to meet the eyes of a tall woman in purple. Even her eyes were that unusual color. Who is this? Anahita asked coolly. The bowing servant straightened, and she was surprised to see he wore nothing but a loincloth, like some lowly slave. I am Lord Kaveh, once the Grand Vizier of Tasnim, now slave to the ring that was once the prince's ring of office. My magic still runs strong through these tunnels, and the doors still open to my touch. I serve Prince Aladdin now, the man said smoothly. The man who had made the jeweled gardens, Anahita remembered. But that did not give him the right to intrude in her private chambers. She'd set Vega on him if he woke the baby. I meant the woman. He bowed again, even lower and more elaborately this time. Your Highness, Princess Zuleika the Enchantress, Mistress of Beacon Isle, may I present Her Highness Princess Anahita, the Princess of Tasnim? Anahita stared. This was the woman who had cursed Philemon and the city? She didn't look a day older than Anahita herself, and, was she pregnant? Philemon had never said anything about her being a princess either. This wasn't the witch she'd imagined at all. Zuleika inclined her head. I heard that people were returning to Tasnim, now their prince had been found. There was even talk about the wells refilling. I had to see this for myself. Particularly the princess who could fall in love with a frog. He was never truly a frog. He didn't talk like one. And no frog has ever attacked one of my hunting falcons the way he did, Anahita said. The enchantress closed her eyes. Ah, you are a witch then. Your magic is faint, but I see it now. That must be useful. Even I would have to bespell the bird for it to sit as contently as yours does. Especially underground. She has the freedom of the air and light wells whenever she wishes. So does Merlin, though she prefers to fish in the wells beneath the city, for she is fond of frogs. All my birds are free to come and go as they wish. I do not believe in enslaving anyone. Anahita sniffed. I would not expect some barbarian king's daughter to understand. Zuleika's eyes snapped open. I am the daughter of an enchantress, not some king or prince. But I married one, and this one will be king when his uncle dies. She patted her belly. Definitely pregnant. I have seen more of the world and of slavery than you ever will, daughter of the desert. I think if more women ruled this world than the foolish men who mess it up now, we might see an end to such things. But I cannot turn all of them into frogs, so it will not be in my lifetime. She smiled sadly. Frogs or corpses, what was worse? Fari, Basset and their ilk would never trouble the world again, while frogs could be redeemed. Or maybe Philemon was unique in that. It will take more than one woman to change the world. This city is enough for me, Anahita said. This girl, woman, whatever she was more like Maram than Anahita. One who played at politics, who had more power than Anahita could ever want. Keeping the Prince of Tasnim from drying up the city's wells through more foolishness is certainly enough to keep any woman busy, Zuleika said. At least nothing a good storm can't fix, Anahita said, thinking of what Assad had told her about the rivers that ran below the desert dunes. A wail rose from the next room. Mirza was awake. She sighed. And teach my son to be better. Zuleika nodded. You should know Philemon promised me a great deal of gold for helping him. Gold which is still in your treasury, for he refused to pay me. I have no need of it now, so you may keep it. Consider it a wedding gift, or a wager if you will, for I never thought there would be a woman willing to do what you have. Loving a frog, ha! Even my husband would not believe it. Wait until I tell him. Anahita opened her mouth to thank her for her generosity, but the enchantress had vanished. So had the jinn. Anahita tended to Mirza and fed him until he fell asleep, but the enchantress did not return. And all was well in Tasnim, safe beneath the desert sands, where the wells never ran dry again. This has been Kiss. Frog Prince Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.